Robert McChesney. He's the Goodsell Endowed Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. The focus of his work is the history and political economy of communication and the role that media play in democratic and capitalist societies. I'm going to quote, "No such thing as deregulated media. They are a government-sanctioned oligopoly owned by a few highly profitable corporate entities." Maybe you can tweak that Wikipedia statement for us, Bob. An article, Farewell to Journalism, he says, "U.S. media system is deteriorating, and this free fall threatens democracy itself." That aligns very closely with the policy priorities of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. Bob is the host of the weekly talk show Media Matters on Will AM radio, and he's the co-founder of the media reform organization Free Press. By one account, and the accounts vary on the web, by one account, 8 books, 120 journal articles, 140 newspaper pieces, magazine articles and book reviews, and 420 conference presentations that would make today 421. Google Scholar, friends, by the way, just a full disclosure, we're in a dispute with Google at the minute about the Canadian Income Tax Act. Google Scholar lists for Bob 13,442 citations, of which 5,745 are since 2012. David Horowitz has placed Bob on the list of the 101 most dangerous professors in America. And the Utne Reader lists Bob among the 50 visionaries who changed the world. Equally important, Bob, who was born in Cleveland, writes about professional basketball. We should have timed this seminar for when the Cavaliers were in town. And driving him in from the airport last night, he said, "Well, actually, I'm a Celtics fan." And then finally, Bob published The Rocket, a Seattle-based magazine chronicling the birth of the Seattle rock scene in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Ian, for that introduction. I didn't mean to cut you short. You were going strong there. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Ian and the Friends for bringing me in. This is a very impressive organization. I started a group called Free Press in the United States, which is a broader media reform group. Public broadcasting is one of our areas we work on in the United States. But our point is to bring informed popular participation into the crucial government policies that make and shape our media and communication system. So we're very active on the internet issues, media ownership, public broadcasting, surveillance, there's privacy, the whole range, commercialism, especially to children. Those are all issues we're concerned with. But I must say, I don't think on a per capita basis, I know of any public organization that has had the reach and scope of the Friends of Canadian Public Broadcasting. It's really an extraordinary accomplishment. And I speak as one who's traveled a lot in Europe and dealt with similar groups there and globally for that matter. So I'm honored to be before you today. It's really a treat to be here. You know, I think I'm just going to say a few broad and hopefully provocative, even perhaps outrageous statements. And then I know we're going to have 25 minutes or so for discussion and talk the rest of the day. So I'm going to say some broad things, some of which would need a lot of qualification before I'd put them in print. But since this isn't going into print, I can just give you the headlines and the details can be worked out later. The title of the talk today, or of the conference, is The Rise of Interactive Media, which is ironically a term I haven't really heard for about 20 years. That was a big term back in the 80s and 90s. I think really digital revolution is what we're talking about. And I think that's the context that everything in communication, if not society, has to come to terms with nowadays. I think we're arguably at the beginning now of what would be regarded as the fourth great communication revolution in the history of our species. And if you understand it that way, then you get a sense of what we're talking about for all of society is really in the beginning stages of fundamental change that it's impossible to anticipate. And the other great stages, communication revolutions, go back to the birth of speech and language, its formation or creation, which is, I think by most anthropological accounts, is the factor that made our species survive and prosper and basically dominate the world as it did in very short order 70, 80, 90,000 years ago in the savannas of Africa. The second great communication revolution, of course, writing and the alphabet, especially the phonetic alphabet, but just writing in general. The third one, the printing press, and now the digital revolution. And I think if you study each of those developments, you see that they changed everything. They changed human nature. They changed the nature of societies, social structures. They didn't act alone. They aren't omnipotent, but they were fundamentally important. And I think we're beginning to see that sort of changes all around us taking place with the digital revolution. The mere fact that nowadays, that people have this thing glued to their hand wherever you go, constantly, in a way that would have seemed extraordinarily sociopathic 20 years ago if you were told human beings are going to walk around with this gizmo attached to their hand. But we take it for granted now, and we sort of feel like almost like a nicotine fit if we don't have our thing out and open when we're in the company of other people doing the same thing. Our economy, our capitalist economy, is being radically transformed. Just the other day, I looked up, which I do every month or two, the most valuable companies in the U.S. economy. And it's a listing you can get online very easily. The market value. And the 5 most valuable companies by far in the U.S. economy are the 5 internet monopolies: Alphabet or Google, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. They are the 5 most valuable companies in the world, I think, certainly in the U.S. economy. None of these companies even existed a generation ago. These are all new companies. This is an extraordinary development that's taking place, and they completely dominate the valuation. Those companies combined have values, almost each of them, well, around $500 billion. They dwarf the rest of the economy increasingly. I think you can make an argument this digital revolution is in the process of changing the way our brains work. It's still very early, it might not, but this is the caliber of change that's coming about. And the next great stage of the revolution is something that I know that Nick Whitford is here in the back has been working on, and I'm interested in, is the growth of artificial intelligence, automation, the way it's changing labor or replacing labor throughout our economy. We're just at the very beginning of that. And to the extent that does take place, I think it pretty much means we're going to have to come up with an entirely new economy, because capitalism simply won't be able to function with the sort of technological changes that are coming, except in the most nightmarish scenario, which I don't think would be acceptable. So that's my broad opening thing. That's the real context of interactive media. It's sweeping, it's world historical, and it's like once in a millennia type change. It's not just, hey, this is the latest gizmo sort of change. Now, it's always been clear the digital revolution was a media revolution. That part has been from the very beginning. It was going to be the end of television. It was going to change how we communicated. And we've already seen the creative destruction of the internet with things in video rental companies. They came and they went. This enormous industry just fell away like the T-Rex. The music industry has been radically transformed and shrunken as a result of the digital revolution. And it was public service broadcasting, or I think more aptly put in the digital era, public service media, that was seen, I think, as almost a certain casualty. If you go back to the 1990s, worldwide, everywhere you look, people are saying, well, now there's no justification for public service broadcasting or media. Its justification had been that there had been a scarce number of channels, and since everyone couldn't have a channel, the public had a right to claim a few, to create their own programming, to make sure social ends were accomplished. And the argument that with the internet, there would be billions of websites, anyone could start them, the market could work its unchallenged magic of the 1990s, and there'd be no justification for public subsidy for some horse and buggy operation in the new high-tech world. It would just simply fall by the wayside. I think that argument, which was dubious then has now been proven to be erroneous. Public broadcasting, far from being irrelevant, is in fact as important as ever in core respects, though it's still greatly challenged politically. It's proven to be popular, not only in Canada, even in the United States, which has a sort of a caricature of public broadcasting at best. It remains an incredibly popular institution in public opinion polls. So even there, but in places like Norway or Germany, it still has a very strong following. Throughout much of the world, it has real public broadcasting. And by real public broadcasting, I mean a service that's aimed at the entire population to provide the full range of programming and has a direct relationship with an audience that's not mediated by advertising. That's what I mean by public broadcasting. That's why the United States doesn't have anything close to that. It only does the programming that the rich guys can't make money doing. You're allowed to do the stuff that no one can make a buck on. And then you have a small audience that say no one wants to watch you. That's the American dilemma. Now I think, and what I want to argue, that was my introduction, but I want to argue in the rest of this talk is that the case for public service media, I think, grows exponentially, and it's something central to all your work and our work in the United States, and it's a global fight when we put it in the context of the collapse of journalism that's going on. And that is one of the great stories that's taking place in the world today that's still only getting a smidgen of the attention that it deserves, what's happening with journalism. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that journalism, the institution of journalism, the practice of journalism, is in free-fall collapse worldwide. It's disintegrating. And the reason is very simple. The commercial model that's been the basis of journalism for the past 125 years, which was based on advertising support. Advertisers bankrolled journalism so they could hit their target audience that would buy the newspaper, or watch the television news program, or listen to the radio news program, or buy the magazine. Those advertisers no longer need to subsidize journalism to hit their target audience. They've learned, and we all now know, thanks to Edward Snowden, that they can find us online wherever we are. They don't have to go to a news website. They don't have to have anything to do with journalism, and a much more efficient way to advertise and promote and sell their products. So the commercial model is dead. Final consumers never provided the money to make journalism a profitable undertaking as a general popular entity in the United States, and I don't think many places in the world. Final consumer, the market works for elite journalism always, and always will. That'll be there for people who own the country. But for the rest of the society, it was a public good. It was never really a commercial undertaking. But advertising masks that for 125 years, because advertising brought so much money in that it made it look like this incredibly lucrative undertaking, especially if you get a monopoly in a market, which really made it like you're printing up money for a century in the United States or any other place you could have such a monopoly. For newspapers in the United States, for magazines, for most news media, advertising provided at minimum 50%, as much as 100% of the revenues. The readers, the viewers, were always second place. Well, now eliminate the advertising, which is what's taking place, and what do you have? Well, you have the collapse of the commercial journalism market. And that's what we're witnessing in the United States. We're witnessing it worldwide. In the United States, I haven't seen the latest data, and it's a little hodgepodgey, but I do a lot of talks across the U.S. when I write books. And in almost every city I go to, I'll usually meet with the editor of the daily newspaper, or the chair of the local journalism department, or people working in the community, or journalists in the community. And I'll always ask them, how many working journalists getting paid in any medium? Online, newspaper, radio, television, in any capacity, how many working journalists are there today in your city compared to 25 years ago? And invariably they say a lot less, a third as many, 40%. In many cities, newsrooms have been entirely closed. There's hardly any journalists left whatsoever. And I think that's pretty much the rule across the United States. And I'm discovering increasingly the rule worldwide. Ian mentioned to me yesterday when we were talking that a new report has come out in Canada that shows a 1/3 decline in the number of paid working journalists in Canada since 2010. In 2010, I was writing books about the collapse already in the United States. It wasn't like 2010 was some golden age. 2010 was after a significant number of newsrooms had collapsed in the United States in the previous 5 years. And there's no reason to think it's going to turn around. It has devastating effects for us everywhere. You see it especially at the local level. Local journalism worldwide in the United States is just in dire straits. It's collapsing. The commercial market simply can't generate enough of it. Now, part of the reason why this crisis is not well appreciated or understood is that the blizzard of internet content makes it seem like we're in a rainforest. You Google Saskatchewan school boards or something, and suddenly there's 900,000 entries. You mean, wow, this is amazing. But if you actually go read the 900,000 entries, God forbid, you find out there's absolutely nothing being done on it. It's just press releases, it's just passing mentions. There's no journalism being done on anything, or very little. It's really, if you look deep, the rainforest is a desert in terms of quality and content. And this has disastrous implications. It's almost self-evident, I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but disastrous implications for the rule of law, for self-government, for democracy, for freedom, for everything we cherish in this world. The watchdog over concentrated public power, and the relationship of public power with special interests and commercial interests is basically non-existent, or only in a minuscule way is it existent in the United States any longer, and increasingly that's the pattern worldwide. And this crisis of commercial journalism doesn't affect the Globe and Mail and the old media. It affects the new media. It's not like there's some magic wand to make resources come alive for people who do their journalism online. There isn't at all. They're in worse shape. That's why we still rely so much on the old media. They're the only ones who still have salvage of a business model to pay some journalists. But that's it. It's not like there's new journalists replacing them in the new commercial model to speak of. It is in this context that you have fake news, that you have propaganda, that you have the loss of confidence in journalism, because there isn't that much journalism. This is a swamp that breeds every conspiracy theory and gives it a half-life it has no right to have. This is the moment we're in. Now, it's funny, people have said to me recently, well, look at all the great news that New York Times and Washington Post doing are revealing Trump's various idiocies and malfeasance. And that sentence says it all. The New York Times and Washington Post, what they've done. It used to be, in the United States, that there were actually 40 or 50 independent newsrooms covering Washington, D.C., staffed with reporters for major newspapers and networks and magazines. That's just domestic, not to mention the international coverage in Washington. Now we're basically down to the Washington Post and New York Times. They're the last newsroom standing. Washington Post has become a vanity enterprise for Jeff Bezos, the billionaire who owns Amazon, and the New York Times. And look at the news that we're getting. It's almost all stuff that comes into the email inbox from people at the CIA and NSA who are pissed off at Trump. They're just leaking this stuff to the reporters who are printing it. Congratulations, they're working with it, but that's what it is. So we basically, it's a conduit for the national security state when they've got an axe to grind. It's not like they'd necessarily be breaking these stories were that not the case, where they're battling the national security state. So what does this mean? Let me sum up then and go to discussion. Journalism has got to be understood first and foremost, and this is where it relates to the Friends of Canadian Public Broadcasting. Journalism has to be understood as a public good. It's something that society desperately needs, but the market cannot provide in sufficient quantity or quality. Advertising masks that. It hid that. It's the foundation of a free society. Democratic governance is impossible without it. It's self-evident in democratic theory. It's axiomatic. It's sort of like an assumption you start with before you go to the second assumption. When you don't have credible journalism, or something like it, elections become a joke. The knowledge of the social world weakens. All sorts of issues, people become confused, no less, and are prone to fake news and propaganda. It strengthens the power of public relations, a spin produced surreptitiously by corporate interests and powerful interests across the board. And we see it in the United States every single day. The classic case, and there are many, is in climate change. It might shock you, I know that the United States is now regarded as some sort of country of superstitious, crazed peasants, incapable of grasping science in the modern world. But 20 years ago, the United States, population of the United States was pretty much similar to the population of the rest of the world, understanding climate change is a very serious, legitimate issue that had to be addressed. And our political system reflected that, at least rhetorically, if not in practice. Now we've seen a huge growth of denialism, and that in polling, Americans, unlike the rest of the world, there's a significant branch of Americans who think climate change is not a serious issue suddenly. So, this is a new development. It hasn't always been that way. And this is due to a lack of journalism and bad journalism easily manipulated by spin and corporate propaganda and public relations. It has real effects. It has disastrous effects, potentially. Suicidal effects in certain respects if it continues specifically in that issue. And that points to the crucial point. We like to talk about, this is true of public broadcasting in general, but it's absolutely true of journalism too, even more so. We often like to talk about how everyone benefits, democracy benefits if you have journalism, but there are some people who actually benefit when you don't have journalism. That's the problem. Oil companies benefit when you don't have journalism. Banks benefit when you don't have journalism, when they control the board. Drug companies benefit when you don't have journalism that investigates them. Militarists benefit. People who want to make decisions without being accountable to the public benefit. So that's why it's always a fight to get journalism. Even if you want nonpartisan journalism, journalists desperately don't want to be seen as partisan. Unfortunately, the cause of journalism is, while it's nonpartisan, it's not ideologically free. It is a battle that has to be fought and won. It's the battle of our times right now. Now, in the United States, which is held up as the paragon of free market journalism, this is the one where the First Amendment means rich people should be able to do journalism if they want to, and we get as much journalism as they can make profits. That's how the free market works. That's how the U.S. is held. And that position is put forth sort of casually without defense, even though it is completely groundless if you study American history. American history, in fact, what we know from the first century of American history is that press subsidies were instituted specifically to create a press system that no one had any illusion the market would ever provide on its own. Postal subsidies in particular. American Post Office was created basically to become the distribution arm of all American newspapers for the first 50 or 100 years of the country's history. It was a massive subsidy that made it possible for the United States to have a much richer, deeper press tradition than any other country in the world throughout the 19th century on a per capita basis. And our U.S. Supreme Court, when it's actually considered free press issues, and it has about 6 or 7 times in the last century, has said that the first duty of the democratic state is to make sure that a viable press system exists. That's the first duty of the state, of the democratic state. Otherwise, nothing else matters. This is our own U.S. Supreme Court has said this. So that's where I'm coming from. I think at the local level, the crisis now is beyond the pale. If you're in America today and you're voting in a local election and you go in to vote and you look at your ballot, if you've relied on your local media to know what you're going to do, it's hopeless. You have no prayer. You'll have to rely on the ads you've seen on TV that are paid for by whoever knows, whoever has an agenda. It's going to require public policy to solve. And I think on one hand, this means that for public broadcasters worldwide, they're ideally suited to be a key part of the answer to this problem. The resources that can go to cover local communities, to give people the information they need to participate in social life and understand their local communities. And it's something that should be seized. It's so central to what's going on. But I don't think necessarily that public broadcasting is the only answer to the solution. It's part of the answer. And it shouldn't be seen as this is the solution to the problem, but it's part of the solution. In the United States, it's going to be a small part because our public broadcasting tradition is so very weak. In Germany, it's going to be a much larger part. In Canada, let's hope it's going to be a much larger part. In Norway, it's going to be a much larger part. I think in the United States, for example, if you look at it as the policy issue for every country is the same. But the goals, in my view. What you need to do is you need to have resources to pay for journalists so people can actually do it who get paid, who are in competing newsrooms. It's competitive. There's standards that they have to fight over. But there's resources. So you don't just have volunteers covering stories when they want to in their free time. You actually have people committed to covering beats and covering the news. You need the resources to do it. And it's going to have to be public money because advertising's not going to ever come back. And there's no other way. We've been investigating it. There's no other way to have commercial support and make the system work. It's going to have to be public money, but you can't have government control over the content. You've got to keep the government's hands off it. In the United States, we know that better than anyone. That letting the government and power control the content would be an Orwellian nightmare. So how do you do that? public broadcasting with sufficient safeguards to protect the institution from government political control is one way. I'm a big fan of a program that actually, ironically, was devised by the economist Milton Friedman, the conservative free market guy from the University of Chicago. And Milton Friedman hated public education. Because he didn't like, these conservatives hate any government program that works. So they hate Social Security, they hate pension plans, they hate public education, they hate health care, national health care standards. They just don't like the idea that government can actually solve problems and fix things, so that they hate them. And Milton Friedman was like that. He just said anything the government did that worked, he hated. So he didn't like public education at all. But he understood that education was a public good, that if you just said you're going to turn it over entirely to the market, 80% of the population couldn't afford to send their kids to school. You'd go back to the age of Dickens or worse. So he said, okay, I understand we've got to have the public's got to pay for it because it's a public good. He didn't use that term. That would be anathema to him. But he understood that he had the government pay for it, but I don't want the government to control the schools. So he said, give every parent a certain amount of money that they can then spend on any school they want. Now, that's become a popular idea in the United States for schools, and it's proven a disaster. It was discredited in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s because it was used exclusively by segregationists, so white kids wouldn't have to go to public schools with black kids in the South. That was why they loved the idea of vouchers to go to private schools. It's gotten a new wind now, and now the Secretary of Education in the United States is a firm advocate of basically ending public education and replacing them with this voucher-type system for religious schools and private schools. And it's a nightmare there. But for journalism, I think it's the basis of a pretty sound system. And I've been an advocate of an idea to give every American $200 of government money to donate to any nonprofit, non-commercial news medium of their choice. And the only condition, the institution has to be nonprofit and non-commercial. And anything it produced would instantly go in the public domain online. People would have access to it for free. So you're not creating private markets and corporate welfare. You're subsidizing it front, then making it accessible to everyone for free. I think that's the sort of thing that can address this problem. At the local level, if they had it in a state or a county, then local people could pool their resources and actually have competing journalists covering their community with resources to do so. So I'm not saying it's the perfect answer, but I think that's the sort of thinking we've got to have. We've got to somehow come up with resources without government control to get the job done to cover our communities, to have journalism, because nothing else is really working. The problem, as I said, is global. I just came back from England and Scotland a month ago, where the National Union of Journalists held meetings on exactly this issue. They asked me to be the keynoter, both at Parliament and then up in Edinburgh. And it was the collapse of local journalism in those two countries, and the journalists are worried. And they see the commercial system is dying. It's on the way out, and there's nothing on the horizon to suggest the commercial system will ever return. And they're now considering this issue, the voucher issue, one of the ways. But the point is that not that it's the solution, but it is one of the things we've got to be thinking about to solve the problem. We've got to come up with ideas along that way. And the good news is we have in countries like Canada, and in Norway, and in Germany, and across the world, in Britain, we do have a great institution of public service broadcasting, public service media, which is already doing some of that work. That's already there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's an institution that can be a crucial part of the answer. And I think going forward in Canada and worldwide, that should be a crucial part of the organizing method with your membership and with the people of your country to make the claim for why this is a valuable institution that is mandatory for the survival of Canadian democracy. Thank you.
Robert, you came in at 25 minutes.
Yeah.
And you run the Q&A.
Okay, I'm glad to talk about anything. I know I fired a lot at you. Any questions or comments? I take true false questions for people who have comments. Yeah.
Well, Peter,
Yeah, maybe folks should introduce themselves too. Introduce yourselves. For me primarily, but for everyone else too.
Peter Miller, I mostly work for corporate media interests in Canada, but for my soul, I also do some work for Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. But I guess two comments, I suppose, but hopefully a question if I can find one. In terms of the interests that don't necessarily benefit from journalism, I wonder if you could comment more about whether politicians benefit from journalism or not. I took it as a evident proposition that they would. I'm now not so sure. Second, more of a comment. In Canada, we have perhaps more of a tradition of regulating and supporting domestic content, but I'm really glad you pointed out that that's not anathema in the US. It's happened in the US. It happens to local television in the US. An equivalent, perhaps, to your voucher idea that might work in Canada, and we've done for a lot of domestic content, is tax credits. You see them in film production, for example, in the US. And I wonder if you have any views on whether that's a bad idea or not a bad idea, because I do know that Ottawa is thinking about something like that in Canada right now.
Well, as for politicians, I think politicians, it depends on the politician, but I think in general they have a ambiguous relationship with news media. I mean, they get good coverage, they think it's wonderful, and bad coverage, they don't think it's all that wonderful. But I will say in the United States, for example, I think you can make a pretty strong case that someone like Donald Trump, and definitely benefits by a lack of much journalism. I think it's hard to look at the fact that he basically, every time he opens his mouth, he lies. I mean, it's just, and I've watched a lot of his speeches, and I say that he's a serial liar. He just says stuff that isn't true, and then he doubles down on it. I mean, and you know, we have a journalism that's incapable of exposing that, apparently, to the point that it registers with a significant part of the population. And so I think Donald Trump loves, then he can dismiss everything that's critical of him as fake news and say, so yeah, we can ignore everything that's said. That's a function of not having a healthy journalism. That's a function of a declining fourth estate, that it's so weakened that it can be castigated in that way. That would have been impossible a generation ago, to just dismiss anything that's critical of you in an investigation as fake news. Ignore it. Don't look behind the man behind the curtain, so to speak. So as for other options, you know, in the United States, the options for like generating more journalism or media, the traditional way that it's been done outside of the market has been to solicit money from wealthy people and to then make charitable donations tax deductible. And if you are like me, someone who's given money to nonprofit, non-commercial media over the course of his life, I open my inbox every day and I've got 5 or 10 messages from Truth Out, Real News Network, Paul J's operation, Paul's Canadian. Countless other people needing money. I mean, and those of us who give us money, we're getting so many emails from people wanting money. We're going nuts. And that's fine for what it does. But I think the evidence is in that is not a sufficient way to generate a satisfactory news media. There's just not enough money out there. And it also has the downside effect when you rely on private donations. You have to go, like Willie Sutton's, well, why do you rob banks, Willie Sutton? He says, that's where the money is. Well, if you're going to depend on donations, you have to go where the money is. So you end up in a begging operation with really wealthy people. And in America, which is a very inegalitarian country, it's a pretty small room where you're going to go to find people with the sort of money who can write big checks and not think twice about it. And a lot of people who might really support you won't have any ability to write checks no matter what. They just don't have the capacity. And that's why the voucher idea is good, because everyone can play and has a right to participate as a citizen. It's a right to build a free press that you can participate in. And tax credits are generally a way to assist those at the top to make it more lucrative for them to participate. And again, I'm not opposed in theory to that, but I think the evidence is in that's not going to be sufficient to get the job done. And it does come with some problems because it does benefit those at the top, gives them more votes than everyone else. So, yes, sir.
Hi, Bob. I'm Raj. I'm a communications lawyer in Canada. You made the point that the internet companies in the States are amongst the most valuable in the world, which is very true. In the case of Alphabet and Facebook, one could argue that given that they are predominantly advertising-based companies in terms of their revenues, and so much of that advertising money really flowed traditionally from what went to the journalism industry, the newspaper industry, is there an argument or is there a role that potentially Alphabet and or Facebook could play, or even Twitter and some other social media platform, which is predominantly advertising based, going forward in terms of providing sort of a stable base for journalism in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hear that a lot. And I know that a lot of people think that way. They're saying, look, we had all this money that bankrolled journalism. Now it's going to these a few monopolies. In fact, all the growth in advertising in the United States in the last 3 years, or I forget the exact time period, but in the recent period, all the growth has gone to Facebook and Google. That's where all the additional spending in advertising. They complete, and I was getting the stats from Ian yesterday. I guess Google's taking an enormous share of Canadian advertising at this point as well. So people say, well, why don't we take this money and get it back, tax it or something, or force it so we can go back to supporting journalism. And in America, that has a lot of currency because Americans, we have a funny thing in the United States. Our conservatives, I don't know what it's like up here, our Republicans, whenever you want to do anything with government money that's positive, like public education or healthcare, then you've got to come up with a way to pay for it. God forbid you can't run up the deficit. But if you want to give a tax break to billionaires or start a war somewhere, no, don't worry about the deficit. Not a problem. So anytime you want to do something like fund journalism or public broadcast, you've got to figure out a way to pay for it. This is very appealing. Here you've got the bad guys, Google and Facebook, who took the money away. Let's take it from them and we can support the public, the need for journalism. I think they're two separate issues. I think, you fight, the revenue, you shouldn't be forced to pay for things unless that's going to hold to everyone. The guy who wants to give a tax break to billionaires to start a war has to hold the same standard. I don't think you should have that. You have to pay for your program to justify having it. You just advocate a program and you make your priorities as what you can afford. And you go from there. It should be compared to other priorities for the government, not whether you can fund it. At any rate, I'm very keen on investigating the power of these companies, Google and Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft. In fact, I'll go so far as to say, and this is not normally what I would talk about, but I think at some point we're going to have a serious conversation about whether these should be private companies, with the amount of power these monopolies have. I mean, historically, we look at the role of private monopolies, like these companies are, and with their influence in democracies worldwide, wherever they've existed, and it's always been antithetical to credible self-government. In the Gilded Age of the United States, with the robber barons, is the classic case. Our polity virtually collapsed in the late 19th century under the weight of the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Goulds and their monopolies in steel and railroads and oil. They owned the politicians. They owned the government. They flossed the teeth with politicians' underpants. They basically got their way. That's how it worked. And we're not far from that, or we might be there already right now with Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. And, this, again, people are so surprised. This is actually a conservative idea, what I'm about to say. Henry Simons, who was Milton Friedman's mentor at the University of Chicago, an economist, who hated the New Deal in the 1930s, just hated it, hated labor unions, hated things that interrupted the free market. He was a real free market guy. And Henry Simons wrote in the 40s, he said that basically big monopolistic companies are enemies of free markets because what they do is they get huge profits, they charge other businesses too much, they soak up all that, they strain the dynamism from a market economy because they get so much power over everyone else, including small business. And he said that if you have a big company of a certain size, you have basically three choices with it. You can either break it up into smaller pieces so it competes, or you can regulate it aggressively so it acts more in the public interest, it doesn't screw people over. And he looked at, he said, and those two conditions hold sometimes, but they rarely work, because the first times, oftentimes you can't break it up into smaller parts because it has network effects. It's built on basically a single network, You can't break it into 48 different competing companies. It's just not it's not feasible for the nature of the industry. And he said for the second thing, the regulation thing rarely works because these companies are so big and powerful, they own the regulation. And that's certainly been the case in the United States with its telecommunications and broadcasting regulation. So he said, and this is, again, Milton Friedman's mentor. He said, the third option is really the most realistic one when companies get to a certain size of market power, and that is you have to nationalize them. Nationalize them. You have to take them out of the market completely so they don't interrupt the free market, because they distort it and destroy it otherwise. And you have to make them public services like a post office and run them democratically. I think all five of those companies are rapidly approaching, but we're going to have that sort of discussion, because the power they have for surveillance, the power they have to basically dominate our lives at every turn with minimal public input, and the ownership, they own the government. Come on, let's face it. When you're that powerful, politicians can't stand up to you. They tried to, look what happens. And they basically abandoned any hope by 2000 of really dealing with the power of these firms when they stepped away from the ruling that forced Microsoft to divest its browser. They didn't really enforce that, and then basically all bets were off, and these companies could become conglomerates that owned everything without fear. So I think that, to go on to that, I think that's the real discussion ultimately we're going to have about these companies. As we're seeing, there's absolutely no middle class online. I mean, you go down the list of the most valuable companies, it's these 5 at the top, and then you've got like another 5 or 6 internet companies in the top 25 or 30. The Cisco systems and people like that, AT&T, Verizon, people like that. And then basically there's none anymore. That's it. They own the board. They own the board. Compare that to 50 years ago. If you were to look at that list, you'd see automobile companies and steel companies and banks. See a lot of different companies, and there'd be smaller ones down the board. There was like number 200 might be doing it. But here, they own the board. It's a discussion we're going to have. We're not having it now. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Heather Morrison. I'm from the University of Ottawa. My background's communication. I teach in information studies. My research area is transitioning the economics and scholarly communication to support open access. And I love your voucher idea. I like the idea of nationalizing these companies. These are great ideas. Kind of building on the voucher idea and building on the transitions that are happening in libraries, I wonder about the potential to have public libraries involved in that sort of a system to support journalism in new ways. Having the funding would really help because the funding isn't there right now. But for example, academic libraries typically in North America are providing hosting services so that faculty have a place to go to publish and don't have to go to commercial publishers. Beginning to see some of this with public libraries as well to be hosting and providing some support for local journalism, and I just wonder, and certainly in the US there is a strong public library tradition, so perhaps allies there. Just wanted to throw that out, see if you, what you think of it. Have you already thought of it, talked to people, or maybe might want to think about it in future?
Okay, that's a great question. I will say this, one thing that's not really well understood, in fact, I just learned about it when I was doing some research a couple of years ago, is that when email first began in the early 70s, it didn't really take off until the 90s when lots of people started using computers in college campuses, and then by the mid-90s, everyone was doing it, or late 90s. But it actually existed in the early 70s and was being done by people in government and a handful of universities. The Carter administration of the United States actually had extensive email correspondence internally in the late 70s. And the US Post Office in the late 70s proposed that it would take over email and make it accessible to all Americans and have a sort of publicly post office email system, the post office. And it actually got taken very seriously because no one thought it was a commercial. They thought this would just be a great public service that the post office could do. And then AT&T shot it down when Reagan got elected in 1980. Said that's not really a good idea. We shouldn't have the government meddling in that, even though the government created it, but that's another matter. So I think the point is traditional institutions like libraries and post offices have a great role to play, public broadcasting in the digital era. What it is exactly, I haven't thought a lot about it, but I know that libraries were founded on public service principles. They have a rich tradition of open access to information and making information accessible. So there's absolutely a place for them to play. A privatized information world, not really good, in the wrong direction.
Hi, Greg Taylor from the University of Calgary. A lot of our discussion today that you've been bringing up has largely been newspapers in the online world, and I'm wondering now just specifically about television and the role that you see television playing in regards to journalism in the coming years. And it seems to me right now in the US, we're in a real period of upheaval that way right now. Fox News has lost a couple of its guiding, call them lights, whatever you want to call them. And I also heard that MSNBC won the ratings this week, for this month, for I think the first time ever. Do you see a future in the system of journalism on television in the US In Canada right now, our television journalism is about to be changed as well. Our CBC National News is going through a change at the end of this month. And I'm just wondering, specifically in regards to television, if you see a future in this area right now in what we're seeing, this revolution or whatever it is we're in right now.
That's a great question. And let's talk a little bit. Let me tell you a story. I teach at the University of Illinois, and one of our alums is a guy named Rick Kaplan, who was the head of ABC News and the head of CNN in the past. And I haven't seen him in years, but there was a period there in the early part of the last decade where every year he would come to Illinois and teach for a week and meet with students because he was a very happy alum. He was a big, successful, prominent news director at CNN. And he had been the head of CNN in the late 90s. And he told a really interesting story. He said that in 98 or 99, CNN had just had his best year ever. CNN is owned by Time Warner conglomerate. And he had his best year ever making profits. And he was really ready to go in and meet with CEO Jerry Levin and get a big bonus and be patted on the back and told, way to go. So he went in there, and this is right after Fox News had started. Fox News had begun like 2 or 3 years earlier and had taken off like gangbusters. And he went in to meet with Levin, and Levin said, yeah, look, you've made $1 billion, or whatever the figure is, in earnings, or $1 billion in revenues, and $200 billion in profits. You've had a great year, the best year by ever. And then Levin said, but Fox News, they only had like $400 million in revenues, and they had $200 million in profits also. They had the same profits, and they hardly had anywhere near your revenues. And they're just going to, when they make more money, it's all going to go to the bottom line. And Kaplan said, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, I'm paraphrasing a paraphrase. He said to Levin, but Fox News doesn't have any reporters. They don't cover anything. All they've got are like celebrity blowhards. And Levin said, yeah. Duh. That's the new world we're in. No journalism. They don't have journalism with those networks. They're just celebrity blowhards. That's the business model. My frequent co-author used to be a regular on MSNBC before he was on the wrong side of the Hillary Clinton campaign. And John Nichols. And John, I go with him, and when we were in New York, we go to the MSNBC, where he's usually on one of these shows, and they don't have any reporters there. They don't have a newsroom. They've got producers and bookers. They break stories. They bring a New York Times reporter on to talk about it, or a reporter who's actually covered something. Fox News doesn't have any reporters. They don't cover anything. So it's not really journalism, It's like, it's technically news, but they're dependent upon someone else providing a story, then they're going to discuss it. They'll pick the ones they want to discuss and the ones they're going to use. So those networks are part of the problem as much as they're part of the solution. That type of journalism. And that journalism is just steadfastly partisan. I think personally, great journalism holds everyone to the same standards. So if you were opposed to George W. Bush's Guantanamo Bay or drone attacks or whatever torture, if Barack Obama does the same things, you hold him to the exact same standards. You don't pull your punches because he's your guy, and vice versa. And I think MSNBC, like Fox, are both guilty of pulling punches on the home team and delivering heavy blows on the other team. And I think both of them lose credibility for that reason, which is, again, feeds the fake news thing. Well, if it's a negative report on that channel, I don't have to pay attention to it because it's that channel. Or if it's positive, it might just be fluff. No, I think there's a difference in the two. I personally think MSNBC covers news better. It's more credible. But I don't think it's entirely credible by any means for that exact reason. So I don't know what to make of them. Again, I think what we need is more actual journalism. And I think the criticism of those stations is justified.
Good morning. Thanks. My name is Derek Hernish, and I teach at York University. And one of the things I always talk about in my class is this voucher idea that's in some of your books. And I like it. It's a really interesting idea, so I'm very glad you raised it. But I wanted to ask you about why we would think that allowing individuals to allocate some government money according to their own choices, to the media sources of their own choices, why wouldn't that also exacerbate the problem that already exists with all this fake news proliferating, right? Every conspiracy theory gets a half-life. Wouldn't this allow people to allocate money to their favorite conspiracy theories, and wouldn't that make journalism, the world of journalism, look like a much more diverse but much less reliable or responsible kind of journalism? Is there not some? I mean, and I don't know the answer at all, but I wonder what you'd think about this. But
That's a great question.
Don't we need something that actually speaks for everybody, the
I
way
couldn't agree more.
like journalism is supposed to?
Yeah, I agree. I think your concern is legitimate. On one hand, my immediate response is that, I think we have to have more faith in people than that would suggest. I think that what we find is that necessity is the mother of invention, and when people feel they're actually citizens and engaged in the political process, which they rarely feel in the United States, there will be an interest in having real information, and they will demand it. Secondly, I would say that I think when we do a voucher type system, it doesn't end the need for professional journalism or journalism education, or enhances it. There's then a really key role to evaluate journalism, discuss what good stuff is, draw people into that conversation. So it's not just pick your favorite type of propaganda. And the other point I would make is that a lot of the sewage that passes for journalism is commercially motivated and driven. There's a lot of money in it. And this system is specifically non-commercial, no advertising, non-profit. There will still be that other world, and no one's going to stop that. But this world is going to be you're not going to get rich on it, so you can support yourself. And that motivation of the Breitbart world, which is to make yourself rich while you're serving your master, that won't be in play as much here. That world will still exist. They can still make money and have no strings attached. But in this world, everything you produce has to be made accessible for free instantly, and it's not protected by copyright. So you get paid, but that's the end of your payday.